Hey guys, let's talk about the unsolved murder of the Grimes sisters. It's an unsolved double murder that occurred in Chicago, Illinois on December 28, 1956, in which two sisters named Barbara and Patricia Grimes, aged 12 and 15, disappeared while traveling from a Brighton Park movie theater to their home in McKinley Park. Their disappearance initiated one of the largest missing persons investigations in the history of Chicago. The girls' nude bodies were discovered alongside a deserted road in Willow Springs on January 22, 1957. Although the sisters' autopsy reports concluded that they had been murdered within 5 hours of their last confirmed sighting, and that both girls had died of secondary shock, numerous individuals attested to have seen the girls alive in the weeks between the night of December 28th and the subsequent discovery of their bodies. The murder of the Grimes sisters has been described by authors as a crime that shattered the innocence of Chicago. This case is also acknowledged as one of the most labor-intensive missing person and murder investigations in Cook County, and remains one of Chicago's most infamous cold cases. On December 28, 1956, two of the 7 children born to Joseph and Loretta Grimes, Barbara, 15, and Patricia, 12, opted to view a screening of the Elvis Presley film Love Me Tender at a Brighton Park theater. Barbara and Patricia have been described as being inseparable sisters and attentive students at the Thomas Kelly High School and St. Maurice Catholic Elementary School, which they respectively attended. They are also known to have been devoted fans of Elvis Presley, and both had recently joined his official fan club. This particular occasion was the 11th time the girls had viewed this film of Elvis's, and the sisters are known to have left their residence at around 7:30 p.m., having promised their mother they would be home before midnight. The Brighton Theater was located approximately 1.5 miles from the girls' McKinley Park home, and Barbara and Patricia are presumed to have had approximately $2.50 in their possession at the time they left their home, with Barbara having been instructed to keep 50 cents of this money in the zipper of her wallet should the two girls opt to view the second screening of this film scheduled to be shown at the theater that evening. It is unknown how the sisters actually traveled to the Brighton Theater on this particular date, although they had invariably either walked or traveled by bus to this destination on previous occasions. A school friend of Patricia named Dorothy Weiner would later inform investigators she had been seated behind the girls with her own younger sister during the film. Although Weiner and her sister had left the theater at the intermission of the double feature screened at the Brighton Theater that night at around 9:30 p.m. As they had done so, Dorothy saw the Grimes sisters queuing to purchase popcorn. The two had seemed in good spirits, and neither Weiner's sister noticed anything untoward in their demeanor. Both sisters stayed to view the second screening of Love Me Tender, thus meaning they would be expected to return home at around 11:45 p.m. When the girls had not arrived home by midnight, their mother Loretta sent their older sister Teresa, 17, and brother Joey, 14, to wait by the bus stop located closest to the family home for their arrival. After 3 buses had driven by without either girl coming out at the designated stop, both siblings returned home. Having by this stage already unsuccessfully contacted the girls' friends in the hope her daughters may be at one of their homes, and upon seeing the return of Teresa and Joey to the family home without their sisters, Loretta Grimes filed missing person reports on her daughters with the Chicago Police Department at 2:15 a.m. on December 29th. The disappearance of the Grimes sisters sparked one of the largest missing persons cases in the history of Cook County. A citywide search for the girls was quickly initiated, to which hundreds of police officers were subsequently assigned full-time. Cook County officers were assisted by colleagues from surrounding suburbs, and a task force devoted solely to locating the sisters was formed, with the ground search initiated on December 29th being bolstered by hundreds of local volunteers. Police conducted door-to-door canvassing throughout Brighton Park, and numerous canals and rivers were dredged. In addition, more than 15,000 flyers were distributed to local homes, and parishioners of the Sisters Church offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to their whereabouts. As a result of this coordinated investigation, 300,000 people would be questioned, with some 2,000 individuals subjected to serious interrogation pertaining to their potential culpability, although the 2 arrests and charges brought against individuals who confessed to the crime subsequently collapsed. One individual, Edward Bedwell, asserted he had been coerced into giving a confession after being subjected to a prolonged interrogation. Despite police efforts and extensive media appeals producing many reported sightings of the girls, little in the way of hard evidence was yielded, although several teenagers who had been at the Brighton Theater December 28th did inform investigators they had seen the sisters conversing with, then entering a car driven by a young man whose physical appearance had been similar to that of Elvis Presley. The vehicle described by these eyewitnesses was consistently described as being a Mercury model. Prior to the implementation of the task force, and despite protests from the girls' parents, several investigators initially assigned to the case theorized the sisters had either run away from home or were voluntarily staying with boyfriends. Although the sisters were front-page news by December 31st, their disappearance would only be seriously considered as a missing persons case, and thus appropriately treated as such by investigators after approximately 1 week had passed without family and friends receiving any form of contact from either girl. Nonetheless, extensive media appeals were conducted, imploring both sisters to return home, and for any eyewitnesses to contact police. Resultingly, numerous alleged sightings of the sisters would be reported to police as late as January 9th, and these reports often described one or both girls as having been seen in various business establishments. These sightings supported several investigators' initial theories the girls had opted to leave home of their own accord. Theories also abounded that the sisters may possibly have traveled to Nashville, Tennessee to see Elvis in concert, or that they had simply left their home of their own volition as a means of emulating Elvis's lifestyle. In the event her daughters had actually been kidnapped, Loretta Grimes publicly pleaded, quote, "If someone is holding them, please let the girls call me," adding, "I'll forgive them from the bottom of my heart," unquote. On January 19, 1957, an official statement was issued from Elvis Presley's Graceland estate. This televised statement read, quote, "If you are good Presley fans, you'll go home and ease your mother's worries," unquote. Presley is also known to have made a direct radio plea to the Grimes sisters, imploring the girls to return home to their mother. On January 22, 1957, following a rapid thaw of recent snowfall, a construction worker named Leonard Prescott spotted what he later described as being, quote, "these flesh-colored things," unquote, behind a guardrail as he drove along a rural county road named German Church Road, around 200 feet east of County Line Road in an unincorporated Willow Springs. Initially unsure of their origin of what he had seen, and believing the forms may be mannequins, Prescott later returned to the site with his wife Marie, who fainted upon taking a closer look at what her husband had earlier seen. The forms were actually the nude frozen bodies of the Grimes sisters, and the Prescotts immediately reported their findings to the Willow Springs Police Department. The girls' bodies lay upon a flat, horizontal section of snow-covered ground directly behind the guardrail, which extended for just 10 feet before the incline of the embankment of Devil's Creek. Barbara lay on her side with her legs drawn slightly up toward her torso. Patricia lay on her back with her body covering her sister's head, and her own head turned sharply to the right. It is believed the sisters had most likely been driven to this location in a car, with their bodies being dragged or lifted out of the vehicle, then placed or thrown behind the guardrail. 3 wounds resembling those typically inflicted by ice picks were discovered upon Barbara's chest, and injuries resembling blunt force trauma were visible upon her face and head, while numerous injuries resembling bruises were discovered upon Patricia's face and body. The girl's father, Joseph Grimes, was driven to the crime scene to formally identify both bodies. Following Joseph's initial positive identification of the bodies, over 160 police officers from several suburban Chicago police departments, assisted by numerous local volunteers, conducted a search of the crime scene with the additional assistance of the forest preserves. The search uncovered little or no real evidence linked to the crime, and the search itself was later criticized due to those organizing the search allowing untrained individuals to trample over any evidence that may have been at the location. The girls' autopsies were performed the day following their discovery. These autopsies would be performed by 3 experienced forensic pathologists who, following a 5-hour examination of each body, were unable to reach agreement on either a date or a cause of death. These experts did determine via an examination of the sisters' stomach contents that both girls had most likely died within approximately 5 hours of the day they had been last seen alive at the Brighton Theater, thus fixing the most likely time of death of each instance to have been either the late evening of December 28th or the early morning of December 29th. The cause of death in each case was ruled as being a combination of shock and exposure, although each pathologist reached this conclusion via a process of eliminating other causes. In addition, these experts concluded that many of the wounds discovered upon the girls' bodies had most likely been inflicted by rodents, with the actual puncture wounds have most likely been inflicted after death. No obviously fatal wounds were discovered upon either girl's body, and toxicology reports reveal that neither girl had been drugged, or poisoned prior to her death. No items of the sisters' clothing were ever found, although their bodies were described by the pathologists as being markedly clean. The autopsies would also discover that Barbara had likely been engaged in sexual intercourse, either consensually or unconsensually, around the time of her death, although no evidence of forcible molestation was found. The official death certificates of both Barbara and Patricia would list their cause of death as being murder, the specific means of which, in both cases, was listed as being secondary shock, resulting from exposure to low temperatures, which had reduced each girl's body temperature below the critical level compatible with life. One of the coroners to perform the autopsies, Walter McCarron, surmised the sisters' bodies had lain undiscovered behind the guardrail on German Church Road for many days before their eventual discovery, stating that the bodies' markedly preserved condition, given the time interval between their disappearance and discovery, had been due to the frigid temperatures in the weeks prior to January 22nd, adding that this had been due to recent snowfalls and the frigid climate. McCarron also concluded that the girls' bodies had lain undiscovered for more than 3 weeks because a layer of snow had blanketed the area on January 9th, and that the snowfall had rapidly melted in the days immediately prior to their discovery. Despite these official conclusions, the chief investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office, Harry Gloss, disagreed with the official time of death, later stating to the media that there had been numerous, quote, marks of violence on those girls' faces, strongly indicative of their being the recipients of violence as opposed to post-mortem rodent infestation. Gloss also contended that a thin layer of ice found encrusted upon the sisters' bodies indicated that they had most likely been alive until at least January 7th, since only after that date would there have been sufficient snowfall to react with the girls' natural body heat in such a climate, and thus create the layer of ice discovered upon their nude bodies in this location. Gloss contended this proved their bodies had been warm when they had been deposited beside German Church Road, since only after January 7th had there been sufficient snow to create such an ice layer upon and around their bodies. In addition to these facts, Gloss also stated that both girls had been subjected to SA throughout their period of captivity, adding that the autopsy conducted on Patricia had discovered semen within the vaginal fluid swabbed from her body, and that curdled milk had also been found in Barbara's stomach when she is not known to have drunk milk either at her home or at the cinema on the evening of December 28th. The chief investigator of the Cook County Coroner's Office, Harry Gloss, strongly believed an official suspect in the case named Edward Bedwell had been the individual who had committed the sisters' murders. Gloss asserted that the wound marks noted upon the girls' bodies in their autopsies had neither been adequately investigated or considered. He would also further assert his opinion that the wounding and assault marks had been evidence that the girls had been beaten prior to the murder, and in tandem with the evidence of SA, were thus in line with the claims Bedwell provided to investigators in his January 1957 interrogations. Gloss would also claim that investigators had refused to disclose these and potentially other lurid details of the case, due to a possible desire to protect the girls' reputations and or spare their mother's feelings. Similar allegations would be repeated in later years by others, some of whom claim to have both seen the original case files and to have interviewed numerous McKinley Park residents who allege both girls had been in the habit of spending free time outside bars on 36th Street and Archer Avenue, where they regularly persuaded older men to purchase alcoholic drinks to be delivered to them outside the premises. Despite Gloss's insistence that the pathologist had taken the girls off Madison Street and put them into respectability, investigators connected to the case continued to insist that there had been no evidence of either girl being disreputable or the recipient of extreme violence or sexual molestation prior to her death. After refusing to retract his statements, Gloss was fired by Coroner Walter E. McCarron on February 15th, although Gloss would insist his firing had been politically motivated. Nonetheless, Gloss would later be deputized by Sheriff Joseph D. Lohman, who concurred with Gloss's conviction the girls had likely been beaten and tortured by a sexual predator who had lured them into his vehicle upon an innocent pretense to continue to work on the case without pay. Between the last confirmed sighting of the sisters at the Brighton Theater on December 28, 1956, and the subsequent discovery of their bodies 25 days later, several unconfirmed sightings of the sisters both in and outside Chicago were reported to the Chicago Police Department. The most widely reported sightings include the following. Numerous people stated to investigators they had seen the girls boarding a Chicago Transit Authority bus on Archer Avenue heading east into the city after the screening. Those who reported this sighting to police included the bus driver. The sisters allegedly alighted at Western Avenue approximately halfway between the theater and their home at around 11:05 p.m. Why the sisters would exit the bus at Western Avenue is unknown. A young man named Roger Menard informed investigators he had also attended the December 28 screening of Love Me Tender, having sat behind Barbara and Patricia Grimes and close to Weiner. According to Menard, he had left the theater approximately 1 minute before the sisters, who had walked down Archer Avenue a short distance behind him before a late model green Buick had stopped alongside them. The girls hesitated before continuing walking. Just past 42nd Street, with the sisters by his stage walking ahead of him, a black 1949 Mercury occupied by two teenage boys pulled alongside the girls, although they simply giggled before continuing walking in the direction of their home. Two teenage boys named Ed Lorden and Earl Zastro informed investigators that while they had been driving through McKinley Park at around 11:30 p.m. on December 28th, they had seen the sisters on 35th Street. Reportedly, the two had been giggling and jumping out of doorways at each other near Seeley and Damon Avenues, with one youth exclaiming to the other that they were, quote, those Grimes sisters, unquote, as they passed them. At this point, the girls would have been approximately 2 blocks from their home. A security guard named Jack Franklin later informed investigators he had offered directions to the girls on the morning of December 29th, approximately 12 hours after they had left the theater. This verbal exchange had allegedly occurred near Lawrence and Central Park Avenues, and Franklin later concluded the girls had been the Grimes sisters, adding the sole reason he had recalled this conversation was that both girls had been both rude and abrupt to him. On the same date of Franklin's alleged sighting of Barbara and Patricia, a friend of Barbara's named Judy Burrow reported to investigators she had seen the sisters at around 2:30 p.m. walking westward on Archer Avenue, 2 blocks from Damon Avenue. A classmate of Patricia's named Catherine Borak was adamant she had seen Patricia walking past a restaurant Borak had been inside in the early evening of December 29th. According to Borak, Patricia had been in the company of 2 unidentified young girls. The sighting was followed by another 6 hours later by a cashier at the Clark Theater in downtown Chicago who claimed she had seen both girls at 12:45 a.m. A railroad conductor named Bernard Norton reported seeing the 2 girls aboard a train near the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in north suburban Glenview. According to Norton, the 2 girls had been searching for 2 sailors named Terry and Larry. On December 30th at 5:40 a.m., the owner of D&L Restaurant at 1340 West Madison said he'd seen both girls, with Patricia apparently too drunk or too sick to walk without staggering, accompanied by official suspect Edward Bedwell. This location was over 5.5 miles from the Brighton Theater. A clerk at the Claremont Hotel, after viewing the bodies at a mortuary, likewise identified the sisters as having checked into the hotel on this date. On January 1st, 1957, the girls were reported as having been seen aboard a Chicago Transit Authority bus on Damon Avenue. The following week, a night clerk at the Unity Hotel on West 61st Street refused 2 girls a room because of their age. This clerk believed the girls in question had been the Grimes sisters. On January 3rd, 3 employees at an Englewood Kresge department store claimed to have seen both girls listening to music at the store's record center. Each employee stated the girls had been listening to music by Elvis Presley. Adding credence to the theory that both sisters had run away to Nashville, on January 17th, a woman named Pearl Neville contacted investigators to state she had met both girls in a Nashville restroom on January 9th, and that she had accompanied them to a state employment agency to search for work. According to Neville, both girls had been in what she described as being a tired, bedraggled condition. A clerk at this agency would later identify the sisters from photographs, also recalling that both girls had used the surname Grimes in the application forms they had populated. In the early morning hours of January 14th, the parents of a classmate of Patricia Grimes named Sandra Tolston received 2 separate anonymous telephone calls. During the first call, nobody at the other end spoke. Picking up the second phone call, around 15 minutes later, Sandra's mother, Anne, heard a frightened and depressed young female voice asking, quote, "Is that you, Sandra? Is Sandra there?" Unquote. Before Anne could bring her daughter to the phone, the call was terminated. Mrs. Tolston informed investigators of her conviction that the caller had been Patricia Grimes. Following the January 19th television and radio appeal by Elvis Presley imploring the sisters return home, Chicago Sun-Times advice columnist Ann Landers received an anonymous letter allegedly written by a girl who claimed to have witnessed the sisters being forced into a car by a young male on the night of their disappearance. Although a partial license number was provided with this letter, subsequent police endeavors to trace the vehicle proved fruitless. The author of this letter was never identified, and the actual contents were never authenticated. In the weeks between the disappearance and subsequent discovery of her daughter's bodies, Loretta Grimes was unable to work and thus earn money to raise her children and pay the mortgage upon her home. Friends and neighbors of the Grimes family, plus classmates and teachers of the sisters, organized various initiatives to raise funds for the family. Additional funds would be raised via the local press and council, with the donations raised via all various methods ranging from 50 cents to $500. Consequently, all funds raised would enable the Grimes family to both pay the remaining mortgage on their home and bury Barbara and Patricia's bodies. Following a wake held in the girls' memory on January 25th and a holy mass conducted at St. Maurice Church, Barbara and Patricia Grimes were laid to rest at the Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Allsop, Illinois. On January 28th, all fees for the service were waived by the Walshegler Funeral Home, and the sisters are buried side by side. Among those to serve pallbearers at this service were classmates of Barbara's. In May 1957, Loretta Grimes received an anonymous telephone call from an individual who claimed to have undressed and killed her daughters. Although the Grimes family had received numerous hoax phone calls following the girls' disappearance, this particular caller, having ridiculed police efforts to affix blame upon suspects such as Edward Bedwell, ended his phone call with information indicating he may indeed have been the perpetrator. Quote, "I know something about your little girl that no one else knows, not even the police. The smallest girl's toes were crossed at the feet." Unquote. This caller then laughed before terminating the call. 1 year after the murder of her daughters, Loretta Grimes publicly stated her conviction her daughters had been murdered by an individual they had known, stating that although the weather had been bitterly cold on the night of their abduction, Barbara and Patricia would never have entered a vehicle driven by an individual unknown to them, regardless of any discomfort. Joseph Lohman, the Cook County Sheriff, who strongly believed the Grimes sisters had been beaten, tortured, or murdered by a sexual predator who had lured them into a vehicle on the evening of their disappearance, died of natural causes in 1969. At the time of his death, Lohman was the dean of the School of Criminology in Berkeley. On the 18th anniversary of the disappearance of the Grimes sisters, Ernest Spiotto, the sole detective who had been involved in the investigation of the girls' murders from the very beginning, and who remained assigned to the investigation, again announced to the media the police had no credible suspects in the case. Officially, the murders of the Grimes sisters remain unsolved, although this is an open case. The Grimes sisters' younger brother, James Grimes, who was just 11 at the time of his sister's murder, stated in 2013 that he welcomed what he saw as a public, quote, reopening of the case, unquote, stating, quote, "I just assumed it was never going to be solved, but maybe there's hope," unquote. In 2013, a retired West Chicago police officer named Raymond Johnson began a personal investigation into the case. Johnson, considered by many to be an expert on this case, had become interested in the Grimes sisters case in 2010 when he had been researching a book he had been writing about the city's history. Having extensively researched the case, Johnson has stated his conviction that the case is still a solvable one, but only with public assistance, and that he believes the perpetrator of this crime had been a 23-year-old self-confessed child killer named Charles Leroy Melquist, who had been considered a suspect in the sisters' abduction and murder in 1957. Melquist had been convicted of the September 1958 murder of a 15-year-old girl named Bonnie Lee Scott, whom he had known prior to her murder, and whose decapitated body had been found 2 months after her disappearance, less than 10 miles from where the Grimes sisters' bodies had been discovered. Following the discovery of Scott's body, investigators had noted similarities in this murder and body disposal and that of the Grimes sisters. Nonetheless, Melquist was never questioned as to his potential culpability in the Grimes sisters' murders, as his attorney had forbidden him to be subject to questioning. The day after the body of Bonnie Lee Scott was discovered, Loretta Grimes received a phone call from an individual who, on this occasion, claimed responsibility for Scott's murder. On this occasion, the caller had stated, quote, "I've committed another perfect crime. This is another one those cops won't solve, and they're not going to blame Bedwell or Barry Cook," unquote. Loretta Grimes would remain adamant until her death this caller had been the same individual who had contacted her in May 1957 and had revealed the deformity upon one of her sister's feet, which had never been released to the press or the public, stating, quote, "I will never forget that voice," unquote. Charles Melquist was never charged with his alleged involvement in the deaths of the Grimes sisters. He died in 2010.